Good morning. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all for joining us for this very special partnered program with Writer's Bloc. Today's program is a conversation with Pete Buttigieg, former presidential candidate and mayor of South Bend, Indiana, with moderator Judy Woodruff, anchor and managing editor of PBS NewsHour. The mayor's new book, Trust, is available at Vroman's booksellers. I understand there's 200 signed limited copies just waiting for your purchase. Both of our organizations are nonprofits, and we depend on your support and donations to keep these quality programs going. So please just take 30 seconds at the end of this program to find out how you can contribute to both programs to keep these programs going. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Andrea Grossman, President, CEO, and founder of Writer's Bloc. Andrea, we did another great program today together. I'm so appreciative of all of your efforts to make today possible.
Thank you so much, Kim, and thanks so much to Judy Woodruff and to Pete Buttigieg for joining us. About 2 years ago, almost to the day, Pete's publisher told me about a book he knew I'd like, saying that I should pay attention to the mayor of South Bend. Turns out a lot of people paid attention to Pete, embracing his youth, his pragmatism, and his insistence on giving us direct answers to increasingly complex issues. Pete's new book, Trust, reminds us why we were drawn to him in the first place. It's about the future from November 4th onward. Trust is not just about our need as individuals to rebuild our relationship with the government and our institutions. It's about why the erosion of trust happened in the first place and why that matters here and abroad. This is not some abstract essay. It is personal, it's historical, and it's of the moment. And because it's by Pete Buttigieg, it's forward-looking. Whether talking about the Pentagon Papers, the decline in voter turnout over the years, or the weaponization of social media, Mayor Pete reminds us that to tackle the challenges we face from all fronts on day one, rebuilding starts with some personal and collective courage, with action, and with belonging. And that all spells hope to me. Speaking of trust, here to talk to Pete is Judy Woodruff, a journalist who's covered presidential politics since 1976. She's the editor and anchor of PBS NewsHour and has won enough awards to topple a bookcase. That's because she's been our trusted source of news for decades. I urge you to visit our websites, which will direct you to Vroman's bookstore, which has a limited number of signed copies of Pete's book, Trust. To make this book fly off the shelf even more than it already has, Vroman's is offering it at a really special deal. So thank you and welcome to Judy Woodruff and Pete Buttigieg.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I appreciate it. It's great to be here with all of you, and Mayor Pete Buttigieg. It's a treat to be with you as well. The last time I saw you, you were running for president. It was a lot earlier this year. So, and it looks like you've been pretty busy since then. I'm trying to think. You dropped out of the race on March the 1st, and the world changed soon after that, didn't it? So the book is titled Trust. There you were, you write in the book, there you were getting ready to do what your team wanted you to do, a thank you tour around the country, and lo and behold, things changed. How did your life change after that?
First I want to thank Writer's Bloc and the World Affairs Council of Los Angeles, and thank you, Judy, for hosting this conversation. It's good to be reunited, even if it's at a distance. And yeah, I've reflected a lot on that moment because the end of my campaign and the beginning of the lockdown happened almost at the same time. Our plan was to spend a couple of weeks traveling the country, thanking supporters, and as soon as that thank you tour was over, to take a huge vacation that would be a chance for Chasten and me to spend time together and start processing everything we'd experienced during my run for president. And instead, of course, the world changed, and we wound up spending more time at home than I could have imagined. Toward the end of the campaign, we would I would rejoice if the schedule revealed that I'd be in the same hotel room for 2 nights in a row. That meant at least I could get up in the morning and not pack my toothbrush, and that felt like a little sliver of being at home. Next thing I knew, I was spending more time in and at home than any time in my adult life. And what it created was a chance to pause, to think about everything that had happened, and to try to assess what it was going to take in the months and in the years ahead for things to get better in our country. And I kept coming back to this question of trust, political trust, social trust, how much the US as a whole is trusted around the world, and realized that it would be important to put pen to paper and try to start some conversations about that topic before the election this fall.
You document in this book how trust was foundational to our country, to our democracy, that we had to trust in one another, and we had to have trust in our government, or else the American experiment wouldn't have worked in the first place. Say a few words about that, because that really is foundational, I think, to thinking about trust as we move forward.
Yeah, in this moment of reckoning, we are correctly very attuned to the ways in which the founders did not include many or even most Americans, women, Black Americans, Native Americans, so many in their vision of who got to be a citizen. But at the same time, it's important to remember that from the perspective of the 18th century, the very existence of the US was a radical statement on the possibility of trust. And there were as many people skeptical of whether the people could be trusted to choose our own leaders as there were skeptical of whether our leaders could be trusted to do the right thing. And I think in many ways, viewed in this way, the Constitution could be interpreted as a statement on how to balance trust in those two directions. And as I write, even in the Federalist Papers, you can see just how much the founders are returning to this theme of trust. How much do we dare trust the government? And how much can the government trust the people? And all of that exchange of trust really builds up to the electoral process, which is this moment where the accounts of trust get settled. Trust among the people as we place our trust in somebody with our lives and the future of our country. And a kind of reciprocal trust in the American people to make that choice and make it well.
And you write, of course, that it wasn't perfect in the beginning, that as the founders came together and they wrote the Constitution, they understood what you've just been describing, but they also weren't able to see into the future and had some blind spots.
Yes, and obviously moral gaps that successive generations have filled in. But the most elegant quality of the Constitution and of the founding was that they built into it a way to make it better. They gave us the tools to widen that circle of citizenship, to widen that circle of belonging, to accommodate and empower more and more Americans. Now, that's a process that even now is incomplete. But what's remarkable is as that circle has been widened each and every time, our institutions become more trustworthy than they were before when they were excluding so many. And I think it's one of the things we should consider as we look at what it would possibly take to expand the level of trust that exists in our society, in our institutions, and ultimately around the world.
And you go on, Pete Buttigieg, to describe how trust has eroded in our country. And so much of it has happened in the last century, number of decades. I mean, if you go back to the 1950s, 1960s, and 70s and forward. But before, well, let's go back to that point. I mean, what was it in American history and in the American experience that led to this erosion, this crumbling, if you will, of so much of the trust that frankly people had taken for granted for so long?
Yeah. Part of what I try to explore in the book are all of the different overlapping reasons why trust has been broken down. Some of them, especially if we start the clock in the 50s or 60s, are well known. We often talk about Vietnam and Watergate. Sometimes we talk about them almost like it's one word, because those two events really did couple to destroy so much trust in our institutions and really in the integrity of our political system. In hindsight, it's almost quaint to think about Watergate, because you could argue the system worked in the sense that a bipartisan action in the Congress drove the most powerful person in America from office, something that's a little harder to picture happening today, if you just contrast the impeachment that was about to happen of Richard Nixon with what happened with Donald Trump. But I also concluded that Vietnam and Watergate are not enough to explain what's happened. The emergence of social media, which makes it more and more difficult for us to find authoritative voices on how to make sense of information and misinformation coming our way, clearly played a role. So did, in my view, an ideological project, especially something that culminated with the arrival of President Reagan that really was built on a movement committed to tearing down the idea that the federal government could be trusted to do anything. And once the people who believed that were in charge of the federal government, there were some ways in which that became a self-fulfilling prophecy. You add to that deliberate attacks on trust in the United States. You can draw a line from what happened in Vietnam to Vladimir Putin, who was directly attacking trust, knowing how dangerous it is to be in a country where there's not a high level of trust, and deliberately undermining it and exploiting very real existing weaknesses, especially our country's legacy and ongoing patterns of racial exclusion, to try to divide Americans from each other and make it harder for us to trust one another and those in charge.
And what I think you point out is that at some point it seemed that every politician, every person who wanted to get elected president, it was mostly men, most of the men who were running for president, talked about they couldn't trust Washington. You can't trust Washington. It wasn't just Ronald Reagan. I mean, Jimmy Carter, who you spend time in the book talking about, of course, you spent time with him, and I happen to have covered his campaign. He ran against Washington. And almost every candidate since then has run against Washington, against the institutions in Washington. How much damage has that done, do you think?
Well, I think there's always been a fashion in American politics to be an outsider, to position yourself as anti-establishment. And look, in my own campaign, it was certainly important to me to talk about what I learned as a mayor on the ground, out here in the provinces, compared to the institutions that many felt let them down. But we can't do it from a cynical place. It has to be from a place of urgency about making Washington better. It has to be about what we plan to bring to Washington to make it function. And again, this is one of the reasons why I think some really unsexy subjects like institutional reform deserve more attention right now, because America really in many ways has kind of fallen out of practice with tuning up our constitutional system. If you look through American history, we generally as a country have produced on average one major constitutional amendment every decade or so. But in the last 50 years or so, we haven't done it in the US, even though I think there need to be constitutional remedies on everything from the exclusion of the voices of US citizens in DC from the process to the clear damage that the obsolete Electoral College has done to our democracy. If we don't pay more attention to those structural concerns, then I think there will be such mounting disappointment in Washington that anyone who seeks to be elected will have to continue channeling that frustration, even at risk of it becoming self-fulfilling, with the kind of mounting cynicism about the ability of our Washington system to fix anything at all.
You do, right? I think I mentioned this a minute ago about the urgency. You talk about the next decade being a critical time for us to wrestle with some of the phenomena that have eaten away at the better part of our constitutional structure and eaten away at trust. Talk for a moment about the urgency of it and about what those remedies are.
So the more I look at it, the more convinced I become that the 2020s will amount to the deciding decade for America's future, really for the American project across the century. And I say that because so many things are coming to a head. The climate crisis will go into irreversible territory or will begin to be remedied in the 2020s. One of those two things will happen. I also think in the 2020s, we'll either truly beat back systemic racism or watch white supremacy defeat the American dream in many ways. I think the decade ahead is one where we will either repair what's broken in our democracy or watch it unravel in ways that we've seen so many troubling signs of in the last few weeks and the last few years. So this decade is, I think, the critical one for shaping how this century is going to go. And a lot of that is best understood through the lens of trust. Will we build more trustworthy institutions? But also, will we have the level of trust in expertise that would be needed in order to confront the climate crisis, or for that matter, in order to confront the pandemic? One of the things that I wrote about that's only become more urgent since I finished off that manuscript is something like the share of Americans who today say that even if a vaccine came out, they don't trust it enough that they'd go get one. That could be literally lethal for American public health and for American individual lives. And we've got to do something about that because this is truly a life or death issue.
Not only trust in a vaccine, there are still people here. I mean, as recently as this morning, I'm listening to people on the radio say they don't believe that coronavirus is a real threat to this country. That some of them don't believe that it exists in the way we know that it does, and some just say it's not. It's only killed a very tiny percentage of people, and therefore, so there's a lot. The gap in this country today is as wide, in my experience, as it's ever been. How do you begin to go about repairing that? You have some specific remedies you talk about. Some of them involve changing the law, but as you say, some of them involve the Constitution.
That's right. I mean, what you're describing is the first time. This is not the first time we've had a mass casualty event on this scale, although there have only been a handful in U.S. history. It is the first time we've had a mass casualty event at this scale in America, with a lot of people refusing to believe that it's even happening, which of course is one of the things that's caused it to continue to snowball and to continue to kill. And so this is just an illustration of the broader phenomenon of the life and death consequences of trust. What can we do about it concretely? Well, in addition to some of those institutional reforms I mentioned, constitutional reforms that I mentioned, I think we need to create more experiences where we interact with one another across those divisions. And one example is the experience of service. I wrote about my military service, but I know that military service isn't for everybody. Some form of service might be, and I think a voluntary program of national service that gives as many people as possible the chance to work together on something hard and get to know people under those circumstances is going to be very important for creating the kind of group belonging that winds up being a very important part of how we make down payments on trust before we know somebody fully. One of the things I reflected on going into the book was, or in the pages of the book, is it's no surprise that at the end of a military deployment, there are people that you form lifelong friendships with who you would trust with your life. But the really remarkable thing is the way you trust people with your life at the beginning of a military deployment when you don't really know that much about them. Anytime somebody got into my vehicle for the first time, they were trusting that I would protect them, and vice versa. And that kind of trust, I think that initial trust, that provisional trust that we offer up when we know that we're in it together with somebody, because we know that we share an overall mission, or for the simple reason that sometimes you just have to trust somebody before that can be vindicated, and then you see whether it is or not. We're in a moment of comparable crisis collectively, nationally. And so service represents both kind of metaphor for what we're up against as a country and a very specific solution in terms of the experiences we could create for a new generation to go into adult life knowing a little more about people who maybe they've been inclined because of social media or political discourse to distrust right off the bat.
But at the same time, right now, what is it, the percentage of Americans who are serving now in the military or in I'm thinking of any other form of national service is very small.
That's right.
How do you go ahead? How do you turn that around?
Well, we got to be willing to fund it. Look, if you look at the acceptance rates for the military, as you say, or AmeriCorps or the Peace Corps, any of these programs, they're usually less than a quarter. That means for every person who gets a chance to serve, there are 3 or 4 who would have if they got the chance. And we know there's plenty out there worth doing. from the work that a climate corps could be doing, weatherizing homes of low-income seniors, to take one example of a worthy project that also has broad social benefit, or community health corps that could help get ahead of addiction and mental health issues. Those are just a couple examples. And people are ready to step up and do it, but we've got to fund it so that service is not just a year-off luxury for the well-to-do. But something that eventually could become sort of a norm, like whether you're going to college or not. The first time you're applying to college or applying to your first job, you could expect that the first question might be, what did you do during your service experience and what did you learn there?
You also raise, and I'll tick a couple of these off, a fairer tax system to get at the increasing economic inequality in this country. There you're getting at what could be a big partisan divide, right? I mean, the Republicans, a number of conservatives have very different ideas about what the tax system should look like.
Well, Republican politicians are hostile to the idea of raising taxes on the wealthy. Republican voters, on the other hand, not so much. This is actually an area of surprising consensus among the American people, because there's a sense, a very correct sense, validated most recently by what we saw about the president's tax returns, that the wealthy aren't paying their fair share. Right now, we're in a very negative spiral. Americans judge correctly that the tax system is not fair. It makes you feel, nobody enjoys paying taxes, but this makes that feeling even worse. If you feel like you're being taken for a sucker, if you don't have the armies of accountants to keep you from having to pay the way the wealthiest do, you become more cynical about what's going on with your tax dollars and less inclined to support the kind of programs that those tax dollars could help build up. We could, though, turn that cycle around in a different direction. If we have a fairer tax code, there will be a little bit more willingness to support the kinds of delivery of quality public services, whether we're talking about the quality of our schools, the level of our infrastructure, or the experience of our health system. That makes people feel like we're getting a good value for money. And one of the places that progressives like to look to for examples on how things might be different is Scandinavia. In the book, I took a closer look at what's going on there, and one of the things that any of the Nordic leaders would tell you, matter of fact, there's a Nordic Council of Ministers, a body that I didn't know existed before I was researching this book. They published an entire report called Trust the Nordic Gold. They regard social trust as a kind of resource that they can mine in order to do things like ask the population to pay their fair share to get quality services. And so that could be a positive cycle. You pay in, again, nobody loves paying taxes, but you pay in at a certain level, you see the good results come back to you, and you feel better about those robust policies. Or you could be in the negative cycle, where in the US, where more and more people look at the system, see the ways in which it seems to be tilted against them, and think, why should I support doing anything collectively at all?
Are you saying that requires not having a Republican in the White House, or what? I mean, how do you make this happen? Again, in a very politically divided country, whatever happens in November.
Well, one thing that I think will be important is to see political candidates campaign on a realistic tax plan and win. And again, this sounds might sound pie in the sky, except there's lots of evidence that Americans already believe, and this is not just liberals or Democrats, this is Republicans too, that the wealthy and corporations are not paying their fair share, and would support making sure that they do. Look, in the end, there has to be some kind of political shockwave in order to impact the Republican Party strongly enough that it begins tuning its strategies toward getting a majority of the American people again. You can't go on forever disagreeing with most Americans. Now, the Republicans have a built-in advantage that allows them to get away with disagreeing with most Americans, and that's the structure of the Senate. But this year, even their Senate majority seems to be in doubt. And I would look forward to getting to a place, especially from the perspective of trust, where I could trust that Republican elected officials I was interacting with might disagree with me on certain interests or values, but be roughly aligned with the American people and inclined to meet in good faith on the same field of fact. That might sound fanciful, but if the raw language of power is used at the ballot box this fall to send that message, we might actually emerge from this twisted moment with a more sane and rational Republican Party, and we're going to need that in order to confront the big issues of the future. We can't go on with one party saying the pandemic is lethal and the other party saying no, it's not. We can't go on with one party saying we got to do something about climate change and the other party saying it's not even real. We're only going to solve these problems if the big debate between Republicans and Democrats over climate is over whose plan to get us to a carbon neutral economy is better.
I'm just imagining how you get that done in our lifetime. I mean, again, whatever the November outcome is, it sounds like what you're saying is it hangs on a Democratic victory, that if Republicans are in charge, it's much harder to do what you're saying you think needs to be done.
In the near term, yes, but these are structural issues, and we need structural reforms that change the reward structure for cynicism, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. We need structural reforms that lead to good faith, and we need a robust approach to media that allows us to filter through disinformation. And one of the things I write about is how I found myself being touched by conspiracy theories that were consuming certain provinces of the political left just as much as they were the right. All of this needs to shift. And again, I know that it can be done, partly because I cut my teeth in local government and politics, which can be as political and as ferocious as any other level of politics, except we are on the same field of fact, and we know each other outside of the political space. And those two features of local government, which made the coalitions a little bit less predictable, a little bit less tribal, the votes, even though they could be close, a little less automatically on party lines. Those are the kinds of attributes of local problem solving that we need to harness into a national level if we're to have any hope of getting through what this country is up against.
I want to ask you about some of what you just said, but I do want to get through or ask you about the other remedies you write about, Pete Buttigieg. One is we simply need more transparency, that we need to understand more. I would ask you to explain that for a minute, but then what about those people who just don't believe what they see or what they read? They don't believe the mainstream news media. They get their source of information or sources from other places that, as you just said, may or may not have any relevance to the truth.
Right. So the really important thing here is to make sure that we chip away at those silos. And this is why, for example, it wasn't the most popular decision with some of my own fellow Democrats, but I've always considered it very important to be as present on conservative media as I am on liberal media. I can't fault somebody for not paying attention to our point of view if they literally haven't heard it. And I think anything we can do to kind of penetrate those media bubbles is vitally important. And more broadly, in terms of the problem solving and the remedies available to us, we do need to deal with this flow of information that's coming our way that on one hand means that the role of the editor, the role of the journalist, the role of the trusted arbiter is actually more important than ever. But also remember that we have access to new means for transparency. When I was mayor, we established an open data policy to allow people to look at even the most arcane details of how the city was spending money or what I was doing with our administration was doing with taxpayer resources. And what we found was, the truth is, I'm not sure how many people checked on those details, but the important thing was that they could. And that did a very important signaling that established that we would let folks know what was going on. And in some ways, I actually valued when something in that data didn't look very good and I was held accountable for it because it demonstrated that we were all dealing with the same reality.
And I want to come back, and apologies about the telephone. I tried to turn everything off. But going back to the Iowa caucuses and what happened there, of course, you did emerge as the winner by, what is it, a tenth of a point, but with more delegates as they counted. But did that leave you with less trust in your own political party?
Well, I knew that honest mistakes and problems had led to the Iowa results being delayed. It was still enormously frustrating, of course, not to be able to have those results the same day, and it may well have changed the course of the campaign. What was even more puzzling and frustrating was to see a conspiracy theory become popular that I'd somehow had something to do with the results being delayed, when my campaign probably was the one that was harmed the most by that delay. But it just went to show for me that these conspiracy theories, they're not based on a sort of a logical answer to questions. They just sort of ask questions in a certain way, insinuating, and then wind up touching on whatever preferences or biases people already have. I came away from that experience more convinced than ever that we actually need the role of journalists more than we have before. And, you know, there was a sense that with cell phone videos available to us, for example, and the fact that anybody can tweet or declare what's happening around them to the entire world, that maybe we would need less of that function of reporting and reporters. And in some ways, in some limited ways, that's true. But what we're finding is the amount of raw information coming at us makes it more important than ever to have the fact checking, to have that kind of editorial role. And just being caught up in the middle of that period of uncertainty just built up my awareness of how important that role really is.
But you write about the very difficult decade or more the press in this country has been through, the loss of newspapers, news organizations. How do you see a way that the American people will be able to trust news again? I mean, how do you, I mean, in your, and what are you, 38 years old? I mean, your generation and younger generation have seen only a divided press, only, you know, in a very divided set of opinions in the press.
Well, for better or for worse, a big part of this is going to require changes, not just in the institutions like media and press institutions, but in ourselves. Just as we have to be savvy as citizens and as voters and use that power to create better outcomes and to reform the very institutions that are letting us down, but also as consumers of news and information. We can't expect newsrooms alone to sort this out because we actually have a lot of power in this regard. Now, the real question is, which level of our consciousness are we going to indulge when news comes our way? You know, there's a sort of lizard brain that's just after dopamine, and we get it by finding, sometimes by finding things that corroborate what we believe, but most of all by controversy. In fact, one of the case studies that I discuss in the book was a fascinating study of the activity of Russian bots and trolls putting out information and misinformation on the subject of vaccines. It was very interesting. What they did was not just push out a bunch of anti-vaccine misinformation. They pushed out anti-vaccine misinformation and pro-vaccine information at the same time. And they did that because raising levels of doubt and stirring up a sense of controversy was actually valuable in itself, in the way that it almost literally seized the attention of the human mind. We've got to realize that every time we click on something, we're voting for it. We're voting for its importance. And I think that many of the same consumers of news who would be horrified by the idea that an absurd story was making its way to the front page don't realize that when we click on that before we click on something more credible or serious, we're actually making an editorial preference. We're stating our editorial preferences whether we want to or not. So there are some disciplines that we've got to go through as humans. And by the way, if this sounds fanciful, this is something we've done repeatedly in the past as other new media have come our way. Consider the new medium of pamphlets created on a printing press. If you handed me a pamphlet as I was walking down the street in the 17th century, I'd probably be pretty impressed. I'd probably say, wow, this person had, subconsciously, this person had access to a printing press. They probably have some credibility or authority. Over time, of course, don't believe everything you read became a saying. And we became more sophisticated in gauging the credibility of information that was sent our way. We're going to have to do the same thing now, and we're going to have to build those faculties to make us harder targets for the kind of misinformation that is out there, and for the kinds of intelligence, you might call it, that gets trafficked at the expense of good journalism.
I want to ask you a question, a couple of other things I want to ask you about. Well, one has to do with personal decision you made, and you write about this in the book. You've written about it before, your decision to come out when you were mayor of South Bend. And you write about the connection with trust, the public's trust in the political system versus the need for personal privacy. I mean, the frankly, the need in all of us to have something that's our own that the public may or may not need to know. How do you see that balance? I mean, I guess what I'm asking is when you write about it, it almost comes across as if you're saying you're obligated to be open with the public about personal decisions you've made, personal choices, your life. Where do you see that line? I mean, how much do you need to share with the public in order for the public to trust you, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, and sometimes I think by giving up that kind of vulnerability, you do place a lot of public in the trust and hope that, or trust in the public and hope that they'll reciprocate by trusting you too. You know, I remember feeling a certain level of resentment that coming out was even something I had to do. Straight people don't have to come out. Why should we? But I also knew, especially living in Indiana, in Mike Pence's Indiana, I might add, in 2015, that after I reached the very personal decision that it was time to come out for the really simple reason that I wanted to start dating and I didn't want to have to try to do that in secret, that there was no way, at least in our community, that I could just show up at some chicken dinner that I was expected at as a mayor with my date being a guy and have everybody shrug and say, oh, I guess that's that now. It just didn't work that way. And so I had to find a way to tell my community something in private but important about myself so that we could just settle that and move forward. Of course, what I found, even though I didn't I sort of bristled at the idea that I had to do this at all, is that when I did, it had an effect beyond the personal effect that I had in mind, which is just freeing me up to go date. And it was that a lot of other people saw their own story reflected in this and reached out, came out of the woodwork. People I served with in the military, who I had no idea were in the same boat, reached out. And it helped me understand how a certain level of transparency or visibility can help make things a little bit safer for others. And in the same way that my presidential campaign, which I never wanted to be about my identity, I didn't run just to be president of the gay United States, but at the same time, I knew that coming to that presidential race as my whole self was going to let a lot of others know that they might have a better shot at belonging in this country than they realized.
Are you saying that for the public to trust a politician, an elected official, that elected official has to share everything? I mean, where's the cutoff line?
Yeah. You know, again, my perspective on this might be formed a little bit by coming up through local government, because that's a level where the people who are going to be voting for you, the people who might be yelling at you at a city council meeting about anything from a pothole to the future of our, something very divisive and painful and serious, like the future of policing in our community, or taxes or whatever it is, are also people you know. And it doesn't mean that every acquaintance or neighbor is invited to know you as intimately as your closest friends or your family or your spouse. But it does mean there's a sense that they know you not just as an official, but as a human being. And I think that's very important right now, where, as we consider, for example, the future of the presidency, aside from the ideology, aside from the policy questions at stake, just the nature of the sort of person who we're going to ask to have that role and to set a tone for the whole country. That really does matter. There was a time when it was usually conservatives who emphasized the significance of character. Now I think both sides of the aisle have come to see how important that is in new ways as we contemplate what the character of the presidency will be for the decade ahead.
So I know a lot of the people who are watching have questions for you. So I've just got one other question before I turn it over to them. But you are in Salt Lake City, if I'm not mistaken. You've been playing the role of Mike Pence as Senator Kamala Harris prepares for the debate coming up tomorrow night. Tell us what that's like. How are you portraying Mike Pence?
Well, the first rule of debate prep is you don't talk about debate prep, so I don't want to get into kind of behind the scenes. intrigue. What I will say is it's going to be an incredibly consequential debate tomorrow. And having watched Mike Pence closely, I know him from Indiana, and I'll say that he shouldn't be underestimated. He's a very effective debater. He's very effective at delivering lines with enormous confidence, whether they're true or not. And it'll be very important to prepare for that. But I also will say my admiration for Kamala Harris and for Joe Biden, which oddly grew during the time I was competing against them, but it's only grown more in the weeks and months since. And I think it's going to be a really important night for America to be reminded of the choice that's ahead.
I think a lot of people are going to be watching tomorrow night. All right, I think I'm going to turn it over to Jessica now, who has what I'm sure are a lot of questions from people who are watching. There you are, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Judy. Mayor Buttigieg, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us today.
I'm here, Jessica.
We have a lot of questions, so I'll get right into those. The first one, hi, Mayor Pete. I'm a big fan. Are you planning on returning to politics? Governor, Congress, what's next for you?
Well, thanks for the question, and the honest answer is I don't know yet. What I know is that I love public service, and it's brought so much meaning to my life, and of course I'll be excited to find new ways to do that. But I've never believed in running for an office just so you can have it. Every time I've decided to run for an office, and every time I've decided to not run for an office, it's by considering what the office calls for, what I have to offer, and what moment we're in, and whether that moment leads to a match. And anytime I see that, I'll step forward. But I'm in no rush, other than that I'm eager to be contributing any way that I can. And one of the things I've really enjoyed about this moment, the first time in a long time that I'm not either holding office or seeking one, is the chance to really throw my energy into supporting others, not just the Biden-Harris campaign, which I'm so honored to be a surrogate for and helping in various ways, but a lot of the candidates down ballot that we're backing with Win the Era, which is the organization I started after the campaign ended. And I get a lot of satisfaction and reward out of watching these candidates, sometimes for races that aren't getting a lot of attention. Seeing what they do, and between that and teaching at Notre Dame, writing, and the other work I've been honored to do, there's no shortage of things to keep me busy.
Thank you. We also had a number of people asking if you would consider a cabinet position, and if so, which one?
Of course, I would love to return to public service in that way. But first of all, that would be up to the next president. And most importantly of all, we've got to make sure that next president is the right one. So that's more than enough to keep me busy for the next month.
Noted. In an era of plummeting trust in our public institutions, from Congress to charities to the church, what policy reforms are top of mind for you to strengthen trust in them moving forward?
Well, anything that helps us see the inner workings of those organizations with reasonable limits is going to be valuable, and technology makes that possible in new ways. I think we are, especially with the changes that the Zoom era threw at us, maybe in a new moment of figuring out how to invite the public into deliberations and processes that go on in these institutions. We also need to make sure that the institutions themselves are more consistent. One of the biggest sources of trust is a very boring thing, which is predictability. When we can predict that an organization will do the same thing, the right thing, over and over and over again over a very long period of time, that's the most robust way to build trust. That's not always an option. Right now, we don't have a lot of time. But in the end, organizations need to prove themselves trustworthy by doing the right thing for a long time. And if there's a long time to build that credibility back up, that's all the more reason why we've got to make sure it begins to happen right now. And the other thing is that a lot of this is about power, making sure the people affected by the decisions that are made also have a voice in how those decisions are made. And that form of democracy can be practiced not only in government, but the way educational institutions or employers operate. That can go a long way toward establishing trust, both by making sure that decisions really are more decent and credible and responsible, but also by inviting people into some of the considerations that are behind those decisions. Many people will criticize an office holder only to win that office and then see things a little differently once they have to make those choices. It's one of the many benefits of democratizing power in this country. It can actually create more sympathy in both directions between those who are impacted by decisions and those who are making them.
Thank you. Speaking of democracy in this country, this questioner says, what is your feeling in regards to repairing trust with our allies as a once democratic leader?
So this is hugely important. And one of the things I write about is the collapse in global trust for the United States. If that collapse continues, I think that's bad news, not just for US security, but really for the things we care about, like democracy itself. It's one of the reasons we've got to get right with the rest of the world by consistently behaving in an honorable way. Now, again, getting this fully achieved will take a generation, really restoring US credibility. But one of the things I was looking for in researching the book is, what are examples of how trust can be built in a hurry? What do you do when there's not a lot of time to earn trust? One of the patterns I observed is that trust can be built at warp speed during emergencies. One thing that we know about this moment is we're living through a major global emergency. And there's another slightly slower motion one in the form of the climate crisis. So if the US were to actually be leading the world in dealing with that, if we were authentically helping all of the world get to where we need to go, that'd be a great way to earn a lot of trust in not a lot of time. A good comparison is what it was like during World War II and immediately after World War II, where the US, yes, acted according to national interest, but also acted according to a deeper human interest. That allowed us to build a century's worth of trust in a matter of just a few years. And it's a good template to consider as we look at how the US might be responding to the crises that are affecting people both at home and around the world.
Thank you. This next questioner says, as a college history and political science student and a part of the generation that grew up with large advancements in technology and has come to rely on it for communication, entertainment, and for receiving the news, what or how would you suggest instilling a sense of reliability or trust in the media, if at all?
So again, we've talked about things that might need to evolve in the media, but I think the question is really great because it's about what we can do as people who consume news. The first is to have the discipline of going to reliable, trusted sources first. It can, again, appeal to the lizard brain a little more to see what the latest controversy is on Twitter. But reading an article that somebody took the trouble to write and that an editor fact-checked is going to be a better way to understand what happened yesterday than following the minute-by-minute hot takes and seeing who can be snarkiest about it. So we've got to decide what we reward, literally what we like and what we click as part of this process, this exchange of trust that happens between journalists and mediators and we who consume the media. And at the end of the day, I actually think it's less about the technology and more about us. It's more about our minds. It's about the disciplines we cultivate and the things we care about. The technology is just a way that these things get passed around. And just as conspiracy theories have existed for hundreds of years, certainly here in America, so is misinformation, so has doubt and division. It would be a cop-out to say that this is something that came about just because of digital media. What I'd say is digital media change our relationship to our own worst instincts. And it's almost a spiritual level of discipline that's going to be needed for us to get back on top of that. And that happens one citizen at a time.
Thank you. This next question comes from a fellow mayor, Lindsay Horvath, who's the mayor of West Hollywood. She says, how do we address local challenges of public safety while dealing with a severe distrust of law enforcement?
Mayor, thanks so much for being here. It's great to be reconnected with you. And obviously, you've put your finger on one of the most urgent questions of trust in our time. And this is a point to remember that there's not just an issue of how we trust institutions, it's how much trust those institutions show. So one thing that makes the Black experience different from the white experience in America is the level of trust that is just sort of implicitly granted as a default to a white person, whether it's walking through a department store or in the context of a police encounter. And as we've seen, not having that trust. For example, Philando Castile not being able to rely on the trust that he had as a licensed firearm owner in the situation that led to him being killed is an example of the very real and very violent consequences of that trust not being shared or distributed equally. So we've got to think about this in both directions. First of all, the part that gets talked about more, how do we use accountability, transparency, which is what body cameras are about, and institutional reform to make sure that institutions like city government and especially policing and public safety are trustworthy. But also, how do we decide what trust is placed in ordinary citizens as they go about their lives? And is that trust distributed equitably? Today it isn't, and that has real consequences.
Thank you. Your thoughts on protecting our democracy have resonated with me throughout your campaign. It's led me to be really eager to start work on ranked choice voting after this election. I'm curious about your perspective on ranked choice voting. Did your primary election make you a believer or more attached to the two-party system?
So I think that the jurisdictions that do have ranked choice voting have demonstrated that it could be a real solution to a lot of the problems we have, situations where you wind up having to choose between the kind of everybody's second choice and everybody's third choice because the system can be so screwy that way. There are a lot of ways to get at it. Jungle primaries, which I know were part of the experience in California in some elections, are one example that I think are promising. These are also things that can be adjusted through just a better drawing of more competitive districts. But I do think that those kinds of reforms to voting are really promising and are an example of how we can build elections that yield something a little closer to an approximation of what we all actually want. The more that happens, the more people will vote. Because they'll believe that their votes count and matter. The more voting there is, the more legitimacy there is in the election. And it's one more example of how a downward spiral that we're living in right now, after the right reforms, could turn into a virtuous cycle that's self-reinforcing in the right direction.
Thank you. While campaigning, is there a trade-off between getting potential voters to trust you as opposed to getting voters to distrust your competitor?
Totally. That's a great question. I mean, look, part of what happens in political elections is saying, trust me and don't trust the other guy. And that is inevitable. It's part of the contest for the fidelity of voters. But I think where it really goes off the rails is if we're trying to get some people to question their reality. Which I think is what's happening now more often than not. When I see things like the sort of gaslighting that goes on, or by the way, the voter suppression that's going on, the fact that in some states we're seeing a pretty clear indication that the GOP strategy is just to make sure fewer people can vote. It strikes me that that reflects a level of distrust of self on the part of some politicians who seem to have given up on the idea that they could actually persuade people to vote for them. So wind up instead relying on denial of reality or suppression of the vote, rather than actually competing for those same votes that they're right now trying to suppress. So part of the issue is not just getting people to trust the right politicians, but to what extent do people come into the political process trusting in the value of their own beliefs and in their own capacity to convince? You know, there was no magic to our ability in my campaign to do well in very conservative areas, other than that we actually went there and just talked to people. And that is underrated in a politics which seems to write off a lot of voters before they even get addressed on straightforward terms by people competing for their votes.
Thank you. What is it about Trump that inspires trust from his base?
So here's one of the weirdest things about conspiracy thinking. It actually, in an odd way, is about a kind of trust or even belonging. I know you wouldn't think of the words trust and belonging when you hear conspiracy, but I'll explain what I mean. Often when somebody's saying, you know, the media won't tell you this, or you can't trust anybody, but I'm going to share this, what they're really saying is trust me. The implication is I'm letting you in on this secret that the others don't want you to know, which suggests that I'm more trustworthy. And I think this is part of how these groups like QAnon and these phenomena that are ultimately very much connected to the Trump phenomenon build their strength. Now, that sort of thinking and that sort of organizing, it always finds more fertile ground where there's more resentment. And there's more resentment where there's more inequality. So inescapably, the level of economic inequality that we're experiencing as a country, I think actually makes it much easier for people to be targeted with this kind of atmosphere that says you can't trust any establishment. And it's led to this real ninja move on the part of this president, a billionaire or anyway, very wealthy person who was born wealthy, who's been photographed with every major Republican or Democratic politician in the last 40 years to present himself as an outsider. Harnessing that outsider energy, making people feel like they've been screwed or things have been tilted against them, which by the way is actually true, but then presenting it to them in a way that makes it feel like you, the person presenting them with this alternative, are to be believed. This really does create a level of trust in untrustworthy figures like Donald Trump. The problem is not just the mistrust that he's created, it's the misdirected trust that has in some cases cost people their lives as they go into indoor rallies trusting that nothing bad will happen to them. While the campaign doesn't extend that same trust to them, it's literally asked them to sign waivers saying that if they do get sick and come to harm, they won't hold the campaign responsible for it.
Thank you. Your relative youth compared to the other candidates set you apart from the onset of your campaign. How important was it to develop relationships with other candidates during the campaign? Did you sense that they didn't take you seriously because they had done their time in Washington?
I think there was a little bit of that. One of the things I found even back when I was running for mayor was that actually it was among older voters that there was the most excitement about a younger candidate. That was not true when it came to my fellow elected officials at the local level, and I had to do a lot of work too. And frankly, I'm sympathetic and understand the position. If you've been slogging it out, and some youngster kind of skips the line and zips up and takes a place right next to you, or perhaps ahead of you on the org chart, you're going to have some questions. When it came to the presidential campaign and those politics, I think there was a level of people deciding whether to take me seriously. But the beauty of the process is you get a chance to go right to the voters, especially in small states. And if they take you seriously, then others will too. If they don't, then it's all over and you can go home and back to paying your dues.
Thank you. How can we learn more about structural issues in politics? Do you have recommendations for books or other resources?
Yeah, well, I think this is a great time to look at the history of moments of big change and structural reform that have happened. It's a great time to be reading about the New Deal, and there are a lot of good books about that, especially that first 100 days, like The Defining Moment. I think Freedom from Fear speaks to this in a different way. The Second Bill of Rights. Other books that are great for understanding an FDR arrival moment that's maybe the closest analogy to where we are. It's also worth reading about the kind of bigger structural things that shape how we got to where we are. Michael Tomasky's got a great book called If We Can Keep It, quoting, of course, Ben Franklin's answer to somebody asking as he emerged from constitutional deliberations if we were going to be a republic or a monarchy, and he was said to have replied, "It's a republic if you can keep it." And the question now is, can we keep it? I think this is a great time to be reading about constitutional reform. Unsexy stuff, critically important. And again, as recently as 50 years ago, rather routine. I mean, Birch Bayh, senator from my home state of Indiana, hardly a wild-eyed radical, was authoring lots of constitutional amendments. Helped get the 25th Amendment passed, the amendment that lowered the voting age to 18 was passed, and even one that didn't make it, the Equal Rights Amendment, I think had a lot of very important consequences, like the development of Title IX, because we had that fight. This is a time to up our imagination about what's possible, because we've seen and been reminded, sometimes in the bluntest possible way, that our system right now is pretty rickety and just not up to some of the demands of the 21st century.
Thank you. And this will be my final question. In your opinion, what is Biden's biggest strength and biggest weakness? And similarly, what is Trump's biggest strength and biggest weakness? And then I'll turn it back over to Judy.
Well, I think for both of them, sometimes your strength is your weakness and your weakness is your strength. For some people, the vice president's, they're looking for something new, and the vice president is somebody we have known for a very long time. But I'd also say at an unsteady and painful moment in the country, there's a lot to be said for somebody whose character we know inside and out, because he has had so many episodes in public life to demonstrate who he is. And what's great about him is it's coupled with a real understanding, something he's shared with me in private and equally in public, a desire to make sure that he's cultivating a newer generation to serve alongside him and to carry things forward. With President Trump, his greatest weakness and his greatest strength is the ability to just completely throw it out any sense of shame or decency or fidelity to the truth. It's a strength politically, sometimes, in a cynical moment. It's an incredibly dangerous weakness for a president of the United States on whose wisdom and judgment the American people depend.
Great. Thank you so much, Mayor Buttigieg. Judy, I'm going to turn this conversation back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you. Those were great questions from all of the listeners and people who are watching. Mayor Pete, I guess my last question as we say goodbye is to all the young people who are watching this or maybe watching it in the future, who may be looking at this election and still wondering if it really matters. Should I really go to the trouble to vote? What difference does it make? What do you say to them and about how they can be effective in months and years to come?
Thanks. The message is simple. You're not wrong to be skeptical about the problems that are in the system, but you've got to understand that your moment of maximum power to do something about it is the moment you fill in your ballot. It's good that you're out there on social media talking about what needs to change. It's good that you're out there in the streets calling for justice and reform. But the moment where all of this actually translates into action, the moment you get to hire and fire political leaders and send a message that people have to hear who would not even listen to you the rest of the time, is the moment you take that power into your own hands. That's why voting is so important. And the longer you're planning to be here, the more you have at stake in a bunch of decisions that are about to be made, permanent decisions that will affect the course of this country for the rest of our lives.
Mayor Pete Buttigieg, the book is Trust. It's very much worth reading. Just out published, I think the publication date is today.
Today's the day.
All right, well, we'll let you go back to debate prep with Senator Harris. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
so much.
you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor and Judy, for just a very special conversation today about how critical this next decade is. I think we have a lot to think about. And I know our audience very much enjoyed the opportunity to engage with you. So thank you so much. And again, for our viewers, please go to our websites and see how you can help support this quality programming. Just think, civic conversation and being well informed by intelligent experts. So please go to our websites and see how you can help us out. Thank you for joining us. Please, everybody, stay safe, stay informed, and see you soon. Thank you both so very much.